Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Criminal Investigation, Homicide Investigation. Today we're discussing physical evidence in the crime scene. Last class, we discussed kind of the roles of evidence and the classifications of evidence, kind of conceptualizing what it is and what all it can entail. So that being said, we're going to look today at how do you interact with the crime scene. And it's going to set us up for the next class in which we start talking about like biological evidence and evidence collection, things along those lines. So that being said, today we're talking about physical evidence in the crime scene. So the crime scene, not actually as easy to identify as you would think, right? Because we have crime scenes and then we have secondary crime scenes. And we can have multiple secondary crime scenes, right? So the crime scene is defined as the area within the immediate vicinity or location in which the criminal incident occurred or is believed to have occurred, right? So this would be somebody gets murdered in a house, you go into the house is the crime scene, right? Now there are secondary scenes. This is the area where significant evidence relating to a crime is or could be found. So we often see this and we often misclassify things when we think about dump sites, right? So if they're dumping a body, all right, we'll say, and the police respond to it and all that jazz. If it's a clear dump, right, we might have a crime scene initially until we realize like, oh, this person was transported here. This person wasn't killed here. At that point, it becomes a secondary crime scene, right? Because we know that there's a primary crime scene somewhere where the actual incident, where the actual murder occurred. So again, oftentimes secondary crime scenes can be misleading because we think that's the crime scene when in reality it's not. It's only a secondary crime scene. There's another crime scene that exists. And a lot of times there are further secondary crime scenes, right? So kind of to this end, not all crime scenes are created equal. The more primary and secondary scenes found, the more likely the police will solve the crime, right? So let's say police get called to a body at a dump site. The body's been like decapitated, right? But there's little to no blood. There's evidence of bullet wounds and the chest area of the body. Detectives are going to respond. Well, first responders are going to respond. Detectives are going to respond, and they're going to deem it as a secondary crime scene, probably fairly quickly, right? Because if you decapitate someone and there's no blood, then that means that they weren't alive at the time you decapitated them, or they were, and you just transported that part. So they're going to classify as a secondary crime scene. Now, we know there's a crime scene out there somewhere where this originally occurred. But there could also be there could also be different secondary crime scenes, right? So let's say the perpetrator killed the person in a residential home. That would be the crime scene. The dump site is a secondary crime scene. The perpetrator's home, where he keeps the firearm and the hacksaw, or his garage, that would also be a secondary crime scene, right? Because it's where you can find significant evidence relating to a crime. And generally speaking, instrumentalities, we're going to kind of classify that as fairly significant evidence, especially if it's accompanied by something else that was used in the crime scene. So there's a lot of unknowns when you respond to a scene. You don't know if it's a primary or secondary until you have time to clear the scene and all that jazz. And you don't know how many primary and how many secondary crime scenes are out there, right? Which sounds like an uphill battle, and it really is. But the more primary, the more secondary crime scenes that detectives find that we start to piece together, the more likely it is we're going to solve a crime. Again, homicides usually have the highest clearance rate, but nowhere near 100%. So let's talk about crime scene management, All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at first responders' duties, then kind of investigators and CSI duties, to see what they're supposed to do when they approach a scene and how they give us a general overview of how they approach a scene and clear a scene. So when we're talking about crime scene management, the primary goal of essentially every single person who responds to the scene, whether they be first responders, CSI, detectives, who have you, the goal is to minimize contamination by external factors. So like we don't want witnesses and onlookers trampling on the grass. We don't want things to get disturbed. We don't want things to get knocked over. We want to minimize contamination from the outside because, again, more fingerprints we have from the outside or more footprints we have from the outside, the more difficult it's going to be to narrow down who the perpetrator is. And then in court, you're going to get questions of, well, you let the general public in and there was like 13 sets of footprints. You don't know. Any one of those other 13 could have killed the person, right? So again, your goal is to minimize contamination. Now, this is going to be a little bit more difficult when we're talking about homicide scenes. Usually a lot of police respond to homicide scenes or homicides, or more serious crimes, more police are going to respond, which means they're usually going to have their blue lights activated. So it's going to draw the attention of neighbors and people are going to start to wander over and watch. It's, it just kind of is a natural curiosity, right? I mean, think about it. If you've ever been in a car accident, hopefully one that it isn't severe, but if you've ever been rear-ended, like this summer, I got T-boned at an intersection. And I was waiting on the police to come. And the other guy like just didn't want to be there. I don't blame him. I don't want to be there either. But I think he started getting nervous and he actually left before the police got there. I mean, we exchanged information and everything, but he left before the police got there because there was a crowd of like people started just coming out of nowhere. Like this was just a random intersection where it's like abandoned industrial buildings. People came out of nowhere and they were just sitting there staring, and like you could see there was some damage to my car. There wasn't much damage to his. It's not like anything was falling off. Nobody was hurt or anything like that. But as soon as they saw the police come, and the police actually didn't even have their blue lights on, they all just kind of gathered out there. And that was for like getting T-bone. I mean, like not a big deal at all, right? Just kind of a day-to-day, just responding to a traffic accident. Nobody's hurt, no real damage, and yet you still have onlookers. Now think about that in terms of more severe situations, right? The more severe the situation, the more dire the situation, the bigger the emergency of the situation, the larger our emergency response is going to be. So if 2 police cars without blue lights on can attract a group of onlookers, just think what 15 police cars with blue lights on, blocking off roads, I mean, doing various things, you're going to be naturally curious as to what's going on, right? Anybody would be. It's like, this happens a lot too for firefighters, right? So when firefighters respond to a scene, especially if it's a house fire, like if the house is on fire for invisible from the outside, like people are going to be watching the fire. Firemen usually have to push people back, but it's kind of a morbid curiosity, right? Of like, what's going on? I'm curious, but also it's a kind of a question of personal safety of, well, they've blocked off the street. Am I in danger? Like, what's going on? So there's that natural curiosity and there's the morbid curiosity that accompany it. So our goal is to protect the crime scene from the outside, right? Like we really don't want the murderer to have left the door open and then people like heard gunshots and so they came in and suddenly discovered the body. So they call the police, and in the meantime, while the police are responding, They have their neighbors come in and look, and people are just kind of like looking at the body, looking around. Obviously, you can't do anything until you get there, but like that's a really bad worst case scenario. Again, because it's going to make it more difficult to solve, and somebody like me is going to tear apart the detectives and the first responders on cross-examination. So that being said, right, we know that, and we've kind of discussed to this point, in order for us to have an investigation, a crime has to occur, which is usually via a 911 phone call, right? So the 911 call it's always a scary call, because officers usually don't have a whole lot of information as to what they're responding to. If it's an emergency, especially, they don't have enough information. Right? I mean, if they're responding to a dump site, usually you're going to get more information and not be as concerned with personal safety or safety of others. But if you're responding to an emergency, like shots fired in a home, that's a terrifying call, right? And it's for multiple reasons. First is police officers who do get injured or who do die on the job. It's usually from a domestic violence situation, right? So if you're responding to what could be domestic violence, and the person's already shot somebody, that's not going to end well. So it makes officers really nervous. And also they're nervous not only in terms of personal safety, but they're kind of going through a checklist in their head of, okay, I have to do certain things. And we're going to talk about the certain things they have to do. And then preserve the scene as best I can until investigators get here. Like there's a lot riding on what responding officers do. So the first thing that we're going to ask officers to do is we're going to ask them to approach the crime scene cautiously, right? It could be the perpetrator is still in there. It could still be an active scene in terms of, let's say you have a ongoing mass shooting or a school shooting, something along those lines. You're going to want them to approach cautiously, right? Not like the coward in Florida who didn't go in and when it was his job to stop the killer, but enough where you're making sure that everything is safe or making it as safe as possible. Again, your really duty is you have to lay down your life for somebody else's. Like that is what you sign up for. So you approach it cautiously because you don't want to lose your life, but with the notion and the realization and having come to terms with the fact that you will give up your life for somebody else's if you need to. So we ask them to approach it cautiously. Again, this is a little bit different if we're talking an emergency situation, but we want them cautious. We want them to note anyone or anything that can be related to the crime and secure it. Now that's kind of that's a big ask, right? If you're responding to shots fired in a home and you maybe heard a scream or something like that, and that's what your 911 call is, you probably are going to get some tunnel vision, right? Your goal is going to be get in that house, get EMS, get emergency medical services, catch the perpetrator still in the house, yada, yada, yada. I mean, you're going to look around to see and make sure like other people aren't hurt or anything along those lines, but you're going to have difficulty securing them, right? Because again, as a first responder, your job, if you're the first responding officer, is to go into the scene. So it's going to be really difficult to secure everything, right? And take note of everything because you're more worried usually about the preservation of life than anything else. If it's a scene that's not an emergency, so we know the murder has already occurred, the perpetrator, whoever it is, has left the area, we find a dump site, something along those lines, then we still want them to approach it cautiously because you never know. And then we have a little bit more of noting anyone or anything that can be related to the crime, securing it, and like you kind of begin securing the crime scene as the first responding officer, because you're not there necessarily in an emergency capacity, right? So again, 911 call, let's just assume that there's a shooting in a house, and you hear gunshots, you hear a scream, and then more gunshots, and then nothing. That's your 911 call. All right, so you respond to the scene, you take a look around, make sure that the perpetrator isn't somewhere hiding, like trying to like ambush you, and then you're going to usually call for backup, but you're going to approach that scene really cautiously. And you're going to do it for two reasons. One is personal safety, and the second is to preserve evidence. So before you, let's say it's in a house, before you enter the house, theoretically, and I say theoretically because it's a lot more difficult to do in practice than it is to discuss it. Your second job is going to be to determine the legality of entering and searching the crime scene. Right, so you've heard there was gunshots at a house. Do I need a warrant? That is what we expect is going through an officer's head. Realistically, what's going through their head is there could be somebody hurt, there could be somebody that's posing a huge threat. I'm going in, right? And usually you're going to wait for backup, but you're going to go in to, again, ensure the preservation of life and to stop a perpetrator, catch a perpetrator for one is at the scene. So generally speaking, I don't care if it's a case where it's not an emergency situation, then yeah, officers have to stop and think, can I go into this house, right? So for instance, if it's not an emergency situation, let's say that neighbors call the police because their 94-year-old neighbor next door, they haven't seen her in about 2 weeks. And now anytime they walk past their house, they notice this really terrible smell. Like we all know what's happened, right? But officers respond, right? Here they're going to be cautious still, but they're going to be really concerned about the person inside. Now here is where the legality comes into play, right? In an emergency situation, there's usually an emergency exception to the search warrant rule. There's several exceptions, but if you're gunshots and you're screaming, it gives you enough to go across that threshold, right? In an emergency situation. Even in an emergency situation, let's say hypothetically doesn't excuse the search of the crime scene, officers are still going to go in, right? Conviction be damned, they're going to get that person help. That person needs help. And that's what we want them to do, right? Now, again, going back to like the dead neighbor example, well, police respond to the scene and knock on the door. There's no answer. Can they bust down the door? That's a really difficult question to answer, right? Because it's not an emergency. All the facts you have are they haven't seen her in a little while and there's a bad smell coming from the house. Okay, well, maybe like she was quarantining and made sauerkraut. Like you're not going to bust down a door for that. And this sounds bad, but if she is dead and rotting, a couple more hours probably aren't going to make a big difference. So trying to get probable cause to go into a home, or again, if you're trying to administer legal emergency aid, but the question is there really an emergency here? So again, kind of cold cases or cases that are non-emergency, yes, we're going to probably ask the police department to consult. There's usually a DA, district attorney on call at all time that police can call and say, here's the situation, can I go in? Or do I need to get a warrant? And that person and the district attorney can tell them and help them get the warrant if they need to. So that's, again, it's really situation dependent. The third thing we're going to do We're going to ask first responders to look for possible threats to investigators who are going to be coming to the scene, investigator safety. So we want officers to clear the scene in terms of, we want them to see if there's any dangerous materials, chemicals, or persons around. Right? And usually we're thinking, if we're responding to an emergency, we're talking about persons for the most part, right? But we also want to make sure that there isn't a bomb, there isn't chemicals which suggest like somebody is used lye, or somebody has used some other kind of chemical to dispose of a body, right? They want to take note of what's there, so that officers don't go into the bathtub thinking it's water and it turns out to be Drano, and they get seriously injured. Again, and this is going to be largely tested by CSI before officers like start digging in. But their goal is to kind of make sure that everything is safe. Again, if it's an emergency situation, we're looking for that perpetrator still could be on the scene. You don't know. So you're trying to catch the perpetrator. And then, yeah, you do a safety sweep, which you can do once you're in a house without a warrant, to make sure there's no other threats or there's no other people in the house. And then that part of your first response is generally over. Now, in between, and sometimes subsequent, but usually in between, we have our fourth thing that we ask first responders to do, and that is to summon any necessary medical attention. You get into the house, you have the emergency exception, you run in, you find a man on the floor with gunshot wounds to his chest. He's laboring to breathe. You quickly look around, make sure there's nobody there. You're going to have your hand on your gun at all times. And with the other hand, you're going to radio that you need EMS. Now, EMS is probably on the way, right? If it's an emergency situation, EMS is probably going to be on their way. But you're going to ask for them. You're going to need them. This also is true if you find somebody who is deceased, right? So you go into the house, the man has passed away. The officer can touch the body, check the pulse, to determine whether or not CPR or anything like that would be a viable option. Usually they're still going to call EMS, but they're often probably going to radio that they need the coroner, right? Because EMS, there's not a whole lot that EMS can do at some point. I mean, if there's 9 bullet wounds in your heart, like, you're dead. Like there's no CPR, there's no like zapping you, like you're dead. So again, EMS may not be appropriate. That being said, we're still going to have EMS come in and time the death and make sure that there's nothing they can do to help. But in between the officer, or in between the EMS arriving and the officer having already arrived, as they're giving medical attention, again, their job at first is to preserve life. So they will be doing CPR if they need to do CPR. If not, what they will try to do is they're going to try to, and then maybe backup will do this with them. Somebody's going to be like helping out the victim, and then other officer, if it's multiple officers, they're going to make sure there's a quote guided path, right? So officers have to retrace their steps exactly. So you're going to need one officer, and it could be the one, or it could be 2 officers, whoever, to trace exactly where they went, when they went there, how they did it. So we need to know from the moment they exited their vehicle, every piece of grass, every piece of pavement, every piece of going up to a porch, the door, when you came in the door, did you turn left, did you turn right? We're going to need to know all that information. The officers have to recall that. And then again, they're in emergency mode. So that's kind of a hard thing to recall, but they're going to have to recall that. Because what we do is we say, okay, the officer, when they went into the scene, they are an external factor, right? They have, by definition, contaminated the crime scene. We want them to, but by definition, they have. So their goal, again, is to minimize contamination. So what they're going to do is they're going to retrace their steps, and when EMS arrives, they're going to have EMS come in, the exact same way and the exact same path that the officers responded to, right? Worst case scenario, like we don't want EMS coming in with a gurney, accidentally knocking over a vase, or I mean, there's 1,000 different things that can happen. They have their big medical bag and they bump it into a bookcase and a book falls off or anything like that. That drastically changes the scene, right? So all we want EMS to do is to be able to get into the person, right? You following the steps of the officer, get into that person, do what they need to do, and then leave following those same steps, right? So our goal really at this point is, as an officer, it's out of your hands, it's EMS hands or coroner's hands. Your job is to make sure that everyone, you protect the scene in the sense of you stop contamination, because that path the path you've already taken inside, and then you let EMS take inside, whatever, that's already contaminated, right? So if it's already contaminated, just keep that path going. We will understand that everything on that path is contamination, everything else outside of it is not, until we get CSI on the scene and until we get investigators on the scene. So first responder officer also gets more duties, right? Like if you're a patrol officer, you respond to a homicide or a gunshot, it's a stressful response. Because in addition to ensuring that there's a clear path, ensuring safety, ensuring the preservation of life, for the fifth thing we ask in ensuring there's a preservation of the scene is that the officer protects the scene, right? So making sure that you don't have nosy neighbors or anything like that, getting them off the grass, getting them pushed back, whatever. And at the same time, identifying, and to the best of their ability, and this is really important, separating material witnesses or witnesses to the crime. So let's say you have two next door. There's three houses. The one in the middle is where the gunshots are, and the guy's dead. You have the Joneses and the Smiths right on each side. And the Joneses and the Smiths come out of their houses, and your job is to make sure that as soon as possible, you separate every single person. You don't want the Jones and the Smiths talking to each other. That's the primary thing that you don't want to happen, is you do not want them interacting until you give them the okay. But you also don't want them interacting as a group as a whole, right? Because mom might have heard something, dad might have said, well, I thought I heard that, and then kind of change his story, even subconsciously, to make sure that it matches. So we want to separate everyone. So this is usually when we're going to put people, if they're material witnesses, we can actually detain them. So we're going to put them in the back of patrol cars. They're not going to be handcuffed or anything like that, but they're probably going to be in the back of a patrol car. And the idea is we know where they're at. They're not going anywhere, and they're not talking to anyone, right? So as part of your responding duties is you have to identify who material witnesses to the crime are, and then separate them immediately, right? Just do not allow them to communicate. And the reason we do this is because, again, as I alluded to earlier, we as a people have this natural instinct. The natural instinct is to really, we're storytellers, right? And so if there's anything in our story that causes cognitive dissonance or that maybe disagrees with somebody else's story, what often happens is this: if we let them talk to each other, oh, what'd you hear? Blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, I think I heard that. This is what I did. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start thinking about what the other person saw, heard, did. And you're going to subconsciously incorporate that into what you say, what you saw, heard, and did. Again, not maliciously, but it's really a subconscious thing to ensure that the story is consistent and true. Because as a material witness, you, one, could be a suspect. So we want you in the back of a police car as soon as possible. But two, you're going to be one of the biggest assets to the investigation there is. So we don't want like we want conflicting stories if that's what happened. We don't want the merger of stories. And people will inevitably edit their story, again, usually subconsciously, to make sure it matches, right? So then we move to the sixth thing. The sixth thing is to establish the boundaries of the crime scene, right? Primary crime scene, usually, or secondary crime scene. Establish the boundaries. This is a hard thing to do, right? Because it may seem like, okay, the boundaries of the crime scene, the guy who got shot in a house is probably the house, maybe the property it's on, right? But what if it's on 20 acres of land? How much boundary should you establish? Well, initially you're going to establish the initial area, right? Probably the house and the curtilage area immediately surrounding the house. But you're also going to be taking note of the fact that you may have to extend boundaries. So let's say that as you're making a boundary, you're saying, okay, this is, I'm front door to the curb, nobody's going to come in. And then across the street, you see there's a gun laying on the cement on the sidewalk across the street. Guess what? You would now have to move your boundary to at least the gun, usually further. Again, the more boundary that we have, the better, because we're protecting more space. We also have to be realistic about our protections, because the bigger the protection area, the bigger the likelihood that somebody's going to violate it. So we have to be very cognizant of how we identify the boundaries of the crime scene. The second thing we're going to ask investigators to do is, or is first responders to do, is to brief investigators, right? So let's say EMS comes, you've kind of pushed people back, EMS comes, they've called it a TOD or a DOA, however you want to, time of death or death on arrival. But the EMS is like, no, they're dead. Okay. Then the emergency, unless there's some kind of clue or something that you have that the person is nearby or the perpetrator, where they're running, you know exactly where they're going, the emergency continues, right? In that case. But usually once we have a dead person, the emergency, assuming that we're not going after somebody, we have an active suspect, the emergency is over, right? So as soon as the emergency ends, then this is when we have investigators that come to the scene. Now, investigators are going to want several things. They're going to be briefed individually and separately, because officers can do the same thing too, right? Especially considering they're in emergency mode. So they might be like, oh yeah, I did that too, when they didn't. So we're going to want to separate responding officers as well, and have them brief investigators individually. We want them to surrender all notes that they take during their initial steps. So police officers always have, and the thing that a lot of them say is the thing that saves them the most is a notebook and a pen, right? And the more notes that officer takes, the better, because it's going to do several things. It's going to, one, ensure that the officer or the investigator knows exactly what happened, or at least give them a picture, a step-by-step. And again, if it's an emergency situation, you're not going to sit there and write notes like, oh, I just opened the door and now I did this. But when the emergency is over, you might sit down and take notes and recall everything that you did, right? And to the best of your ability. It's better if it happens in real time. Like if you can take notes while you're doing everything else, like more power to you, but it's not happening. But you have to surrender all of your notes that you took during your initial steps to investigators, right? So they're going to ask you questions. You're going to give them your notes. You're going to talk to them about what you did. You're going to show them the boundaries. You're going to show them the path. You're going to say like, oh yeah, EMS came in, they knocked this book off the shelf. I didn't pick it up. I didn't move it. But just so you know, that book was already on the shelf. It was on the shelf before EMS arrived. Things like that, like really big things that somehow the crime scene changed because of what the officer did, or EMS did, investigators absolutely need to know, right? Because we have a book just kind of in the middle of the floor, Was there a struggle? I mean, that kind of changes some of our initial theories. So yeah, their job is as a first responder kind of sucks. You have so much to do and you're responsible for so much. Part of the reason, this is part of the reason the officers, again, with big scenes, emergency situations, several officers respond because it's so it's not on just one officer to deal with this emergency situation and then do all these steps, right? It's usually the duties of multiple officers. They quickly say, okay, you go and do this. They clear the scene. They're like, okay, it's clear. All right, I'll go establish the boundaries. Okay, I'll call the detectives. Okay, I'll do protective sweep. Like they kind of break up their duties. And at this point, the emergency is over. And so they should be taking notes step by step of what they've done, but also what they are doing as they do it. So they surrender that to investigators. And then finally, we ask them to record information, observations, and actions in required police reports immediately following the surrender of the crime scene. Right, so as soon as the officers surrender the scene to investigators, to detectives, say, you know, emergency is over, I'm transferring the scene to you, then those officers have to go back to that station immediately and file their reports. You know, while it's still fresh in their mind, while it's still living there. Because usually kind of spontaneous, this is what I think happened, even if it's a little jumbled, is going to be a lot better than if I give you a day or two to think about it and you come up with a really good story. No, I want to see everything that you thought, everything, and we can go back later and do another copy and put it in order. But we want to see, like, well, what all happened, what were your observations, what transpired, etc. Now, one thing I'll say that it irks investigators, but it is necessary, is the damage that EMS or police officers can do to a body, right? So if the person is still alive when officers respond, they're going to be doing life support activities, to say the least. And when EMS comes in, they're going to be doing things to support life. Well, this might include rolling over a person, right? You're doing CPR and you're doing it right, you're going to break a rib. So maybe you've cracked a rib while you're trying to do CPR. And now suddenly you didn't have the mask, so you did the mouth-to-mouth CPR. Usually we do masks, but you did mouth-to-mouth CPR. So now there's DNA. Your DNA is now in the mouth of the dead person, who has been turned over, who has had their ribs cracked, who trace evidence, which is just like minor evidence that you can't see really, like this from like hair fibers and things like that, all gets disturbed, right? And the whole scene changes. And so we need investigators to know that, and we need the police to report that, what exactly transpired. Not because they will get in trouble for it. They won't. They were just trying to save a life. That's their primary goal, right? Is safety, preservation, and the preservation of life, preservation of the scene. We want them to preserve life, not go, well, it looks like you're going to die. I'll go check the boundaries. Like, no, we don't want that, right? We want them to try and save somebody's life. So, but we need to know exactly what they did, where the body was originally, what their original observations were, because we can't undo what EMS did, what the police did, etc. We can't undo that and see the crime scene like it was, like if it was undisturbed, right? Because now it's disturbed. So we need to be able to kind of work backwards and say, okay, this is what the scene looked like, right, before all this other stuff happened. So then that transpires, and we have the surrender of the crime scene to investigators. So investigators also have several jobs. So investigators get the call to respond to the scene, right? The first thing they're going to need to do, this makes sense given what we've already kind of talked about, the first thing that they're going to need to do is talk to their first responding officers, right? Again, in separate locations, getting their notes, getting all this information from them. And then then and only then, and this usually occurs outside of the residence or outside of the crime scene. Sometimes they'll do it on the inside, so police can officers can point to different things and explain it. But again, it's going to be separated as much as possible. Now, once they've talked to the investigating officer and they kind of have just a really not many details in this idea, but an idea of what's going on, the first job is going to assess the crime scene for safety, right? While assigning personnel to interview witnesses as soon as possible. So the officers, obviously primary officers, they're going to do a safety sweep. We want investigators, before they start really getting into their investigation and starting to take pictures and take notes and things like that, we want to make sure that they also check the surrounding area for safety, right? Worst case, because you don't want there to be like a pipe bomb laying in the closet or something like that. Police can overlook that if they're doing a very quick safety sweep looking for a person. They could overlook really harsh chemicals that should not be stacked near each other. That if they mix, they combust. So investigators really have to take that kind of cooler head approach, look around, make sure it's a safe scene, and at the same time assign officers who usually aren't first responding officers, but usually other detectives or second responding officers that haven't come as part of the emergency but have come as part of the investigation. We're going to have them interview witnesses as soon as possible, right? So material witnesses, they're going to be in the back of police cars. General witnesses, again, we don't want anybody talking to each other if we can. And we want to interview them as soon as possible so that a couple things. One, they don't change their story. And two, they don't forget their story, right? We want to know what their initial impressions are, because human memory is terrible. That's why eyewitness identifications are so bad. And we'll talk about eyewitness identifications in a later class. But human memories is absolutely terrible. In an hour, again, kind of coming from an emergency situation, your brain's going to change the story. You're not doing it on purpose, but your brain's going to fill in gaps, right? Because we don't want cognitive dissonance. We want a story that makes sense. Your brain's going to fill in the gaps, and it's going to convince you that this is what you saw. In reality, it wasn't, right? So this is why as soon as possible, we interview witnesses. Now, this should, if we're talking it's like in a residential area, even industrial parks, we really need to do a neighborhood canvass, right? So we're assigning officers to do neighborhood canvass. All this information should be recorded. So who's doing what has to be recorded. When we switch and we talk specifically about homicide investigation and we look at the steps, there's actually a checklist in the FBI book that investigators can just follow and just check things off and write names next to things and really approach this in a very intelligent manner. So neighborhood canvass, this is going to be the surrounding area. There's obviously people who've come out of their houses you're going to be talking to, but you're going to go, depending on the nature of the scene and kind of first impressions, you're going to go house to house. If it's the middle of the night, waking people up, like, hey, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Do you know anything? And you're going to want them to go house to house to house to house in the area. If we're talking like industrial parks or maybe like a rundown area of town where there's a homeless population, you're going to want, and this is going to be really tough, to canvass the homeless population there. Right, try to keep them separate as possible and ask them, like, did you hear anything? Did you say anything? Which is always problematic because just kind of like maybe like prostitutes, homeless people, they all kind of have a code, right, where you don't really talk to law enforcement, and there's numerous reasons for that. But if you're having to do a canvass of a homeless population, best of luck, right? Now, so, I mean, that's not to say that every single homeless person is the same way or believes the same thing. It's just kind of a code, right? You live on the streets, that you have a code that you live by, and it literally saves your life. So they're going to follow that code. Now, as you are doing the neighborhood canvas, as you are talking to witnesses, right? Whether it's, and again, neighborhood canvas, whether it's homeless population, whether it's houses, whether it's in a very affluent area, whether it's in the middle of a farm town, whatever, everybody should be taking notes. Everybody should be writing down exactly what the people have said that they've talked to, and also their impressions, the officer's impressions. Now, the officer is not going to share their impressions with the witness, but the officer needs to write their impressions down, like they're lying, or it seemed like they couldn't remember what they were talking about. They need to take some kind of notes in terms of their impressions. And the idea here, right, again, is this is the same reason we separate material witnesses, is one of them could be the perpetrator, right? Like, especially material witnesses, people who have are instrumental in proving there was a death or something along those lines. We're gonna want to talk to them, and we're gonna want to take note of where they live, where we're gonna get all their information, because they could be the perpetrator, right? Because it's easy to run out a back door, then come down a street when you see a bunch of lights and, oh, what's going on? Right? And we know that some offenders do that as part of their MO, is they want to see what's happening. They want to see the chaos that they've caused. Now, this is going to be usually like if you're talking maybe a serial killer or somebody who's definitely premeditated a murder or something along those lines. This doesn't happen usually if we're talking a domestic violence situation. Usually the perp runs, right? If the perp runs and we know the perp, we have a good reason to believe that it was a domestic violence situation, and the witnesses saw the husband run out of the house covered in blood, get into his pickup and squeal out of the driveway, right? We're going to do an APB, an all points bulletin, to look out for this vehicle, right? Because maybe there's an innocent reason, probably not. And they're going to do a felony stop on the vehicle, and that's a whole process. And again, the emergency continues as long as that perpetrator is out there. Once the perpetrator's taken into custody, or once we realize that we don't know who the perpetrator is, there's no more violence that looks like it's going to occur, then the emergency is technically passed. Now, again, as we're talking to witnesses and taking impressions, the second thing we're going to want investigators to do is to make a secondary determination for the need for a search warrant, right? So you have to determine again the need for a search warrant. And this is really important because I've said a couple of times, at different times, the emergency ends, right? So if the only way you have into somebody's house is because there is an emergency, and that there's an exception for emergency circumstances when it comes to search warrants, search warrants. Once that emergency ends, you're probably going to need more information. You're probably going to need a warrant. You're going to want to cover yourself, right? Because the emergency's over. Now you're wanting to make sure that every single piece of evidence gets collected. Every single piece of evidence will come in later at trial. You don't want the defense trying to exclude evidence because it should have been covered by a search warrant. So really, you're probably going to do another determination if you need a search warrant. Most of the time, if you find a dead body, you find a crime, once you're in the house, you're usually in the house. But you're always can play it safe than sorry, and that's what investigators are going to do. Even if they know that they've met exceptions to the warrant requirement, they are probably still going to get a warrant from a judge, right? Hey, judge, we found a dead body in this house. And that judge is going to sign probable cause warrant in a friggin' heartbeat. And there's always a judge on call 24 hours a day that can issue warrants and other things. And the officers do not need to have the warrant in hand. So as long as the judge they can have a conference over the phone and the judge says, yeah, I'll sign the warrant. then they can go ahead and proceed. Nobody has to like bring the physical warrant to the scene. So they're probably gonna get a warrant. It's always the best thing to do, right? And especially if you can do it quickly. If it's going to take a long time, that's a little bit different story, but because evidence decays. But if you can do it quickly, you're going to, and that's just so that it preserves everything, right? Now it's going to be a little bit easier to do in a situation where you have bullet wounds. Somebody was obviously, there's foul play that's just obvious, right? It's different if we kind of go back to my other example of the 94-year-old dead rotting neighbor. If you finally get inside the house, let's say that you didn't have a warrant, should have, didn't have a warrant, you get inside the house, you find the body. Can you look through the rest of the house? I mean, you can do it in a protective sweep, sure, but can you search through drawers? Can you do without a warrant? Probably not, right? Now there's arguments that the person is dead, and so theoretically you're not violating their rights, but you're violating the rights of their estate. There's all kinds of issues that come into play there. But you're definitely going to want a warrant in that situation. And that's going to be a little tougher to get a warrant in that situation because the judge is going to say, why? Like, do you have any probable cause and any evidence to believe that you will find information about the person's death in the house? Like, was there strangulation? Was there a chair knocked over? Like, what was there that justifies your need to search through this person, and there's still a person, this person's house? That's going to be a more difficult one to prove, right? And you see in the cops, and they're not going to. If it's a 94-year-old person, there's no sign of struggle. The person has been dead for a while. Yes, they're going to call investigators. They're going to do a death investigation, and we'll talk about death investigations when they're equivocal. But they're going to follow those steps, but they're not going to be doing big searches. They're not going to waste their time. Like, she probably just died and then started to decay, which we'll get into later in this course, the steps of what it looks like when people decay at different times and what happens to the body immediately after death. Like, the things that you see are just, do not eat before you watch this video. So we're going to make the warrant determination. The third thing we're going to do is they're going to create an official path of entry and movement for crime scene personnel. And next class, we're going to talk about crime scene personnel and get into some forensic aspects of this course. But really, they're going to make sure that the officer's entryway is what is being used, unless there's a better way that has already been cleared for evidence or something like that. But they're going to make a path of entry. They're going to say, okay, if you are coming into this crime scene, you have to follow these footsteps exactly. Right? And this is true for if a blood tech comes in and they're going to do blood spatter, they're going to do blood analysis, or you have somebody who's going to come in and take fingerprints, or you have whatever. They all have to follow this kind of same official path, and the officers control movement, right? So the officer or the investigators, it's their scene. So usually they're going to send one person in at a time to do one task at a time. Now they'll have other people in there to observe, to make sure, other officers to make sure that they can testify, like, this is what happened. This is what this guy did and things like that. But they're going to have to sign them into the scene. They're going to have to sign them out of the scene. So what time did they go in? Who were they? What was their purpose? What time did they leave? Who were they? What was their purpose? What did they discover or do? They're going to create a log so that they know who goes in and who goes out. And again, the reason they're doing it is every time a single person goes in, the more contaminated the crime scene becomes, and the more likely it is someone like me is going to challenge the evidence. And the fourth thing we're asking investigators to do is determine the need for and request additional investigators and equipment. Right? So if, let's say, it's the dead neighbor that's rotting, right? The 94-year-old woman. Investigators are going to respond. Investigators, they're probably going to say, okay, there's no need for us to do luminol spray. Like, there's no cuts, there's no anything, there's no bullet wounds. Like, she was just old. They're probably not going to ask for special equipment, right? Like they're not going to be asking for basically stands that you can like laser stands where you can like kind of point the direction of where gunshots came from and kind of that sort of thing. They're not usually going to ask for fingerprinting, the fingerprint unit. They're not going to be asking for any of that. They're probably just going to call the coroner and just, natural death, right? But if we get to the crime scene where the man's been shot several times in the chest, well, as an investigator, I'm going to say, well, we definitely need somebody to take pictures of the crime scene. We need a forensic analysis or a ballistics person to maybe take a look at wound patterns or at least observe the collection of spent bullet casings and things like that, so that they can then later run those tests. We're going to say, okay, maybe we do need certain things. Maybe we do need luminol spray. Maybe we do need whatever kind of equipment we need. And there's a lot of specialized equipment. They're going to call it in. So that's not going to respond to the scene immediately, right? CSI doesn't really get responding to a scene until the detectives call them in, because they need to know what they have to bring, right? I was going to say in Boston, I know the crime scene response unit was an old ambulance. Like it said Boston Police on the side, and it was crime scene response. So, they carry some equipment with them, but if they need something really specialized, the detectives are going to need to tell them. So they're going to request additional investigators if they need them, additional equipment. And then we start to process the crime scene, right? So we have everybody on the scene. We've got an official entryway, exitway. We have a log. We've taken notes. We've separated witnesses. People are being questioned. And all this can kind of happen at the same time. So then we start processing the scene. And how do we process the scene? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can go about it, right? So the first thing we're going to do when we are processing the scene is determine everyone's job. You would think like it would be fairly easy to know. It's not. Even like CSIs who have specialized duties, who literally their only job is to photograph. We have to ensure they know that their entire job is to photograph. They are not allowed to touch anything. They can't move a body or move a hand to like get a picture under something unless the investigators approve it, right? So we really have to kind of lay down the law for everyone in terms of this is exactly what you can do. You cannot do anything else beyond that without talking to us as the detectives or the lead detective. So you're going to establish everyone's duties. You're going to establish procedure for the documentation and collection of evidence. So you're going to say, okay, first thing that's going to happen is we want photos of the crime scene, blank photos, basically without evidence markers. Then, if prudent, right, like unless we're searching for fingerprints, something like that, if we're searching for fingerprints, have fingerprinting, have luminol, whatever you need to do. Then we're going to have a second round of photographs, and these will have evidence markers, things along those lines. All right, so that kind of leads us into our third point is before we collect any evidence, and we have to come up with a strategy of like, we're going to do this, then this, then this, then this, then this. We can't do it on the fly. We have to think it through. Once we think it through, once we have our plan, before we can collect any piece of evidence, we have to photograph the scene, right? Usually we're talking without markers first, and then after we've done everything else with markers, and then as we change things, as we move bodies, as we adjust, with markers and notes and time and stamps that say like, this is what we did. But we're going to want photographs of the scene just as it is, right? Because that's the purest form of what you're going to get from the crime scene. Because after that photos are taken, people are going to be doing different things in the scene. They're going to be looking around. They're going to be searching in different places, and it's going to contaminate the scene. So the photos, we need it to be like, okay, this is what police came in and saw. Or, well, this is what happened when EMS left. This is what the scene was like when detectives arrived, and we can just call the officers to tell like what happened before that. We're going to measure a lot. And we are going to take the photograph. We're usually going to take the measurements and sketch the crime scene. So crime scene sketches are a real thing. They're not pretty, but they are a thing. So you're going to want to sketch the crime scene. It's going to have to be, just have extensive details. It's going to have to be usually in scale. So you're going to say, okay, there's the, this room that we're in, or just say, well, there's a room we find a body in. You can say, okay, it's 12 feet long, 8 foot tall ceilings. Like you're going to be doing measurements, and you're going to be sketching out the crime scene, hopefully to scale. And you're going to want to include like a little scale, a little legend on the side. And you're going to extensively detail the sketch with the date, the time, the location. Now, this is where people go start to question it. What? Weather conditions. Holy cow. Weather conditions are important. Like if you kill somebody outside and it's raining, that evidence is getting washed away. Like the trace evidence especially is getting washed away. Like there's not a whole lot they can do. So if it looks like it's gonna rain, you get tarps out, or you get tents out basically, and you make sure that if it's an outside scene, that that body is preserved, protected from the elements, because you don't want it getting wet. You don't want trace evidence to wash off. So we want to know weather conditions. We're also going to talk about like things like humidity, right? And the reason we are going to want to know what the humidity is at that time when detectives arrive is largely because of fingerprints, right? So I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but fingerprints are about 80% water, right? So they're also chance impressions, meaning you don't leave, contrary to popular belief, fingerprint every time you touch a surface. It really depends on like when's the last time you washed your hands, what's the nature of the surface, like what are the pores doing on your thumb? There's a lot of questions come into play, but we have to note humidity, because and outdoor temperature as well, because really the higher the temperature and the higher the rate at which water is being absorbed into the atmosphere plays a really big role on if we're going to find fingerprints or not, right? So I kind of discussed last time, there's a big difference in terms of time frame between finding a fingerprint in Alaska versus finding a fingerprint in Arizona during the summer, right? In Alaska, you probably got at least a couple days, right? Unless there's really, unless the water's being absorbed into the air very quickly, you're probably going to have more time, right? Because it's going to preserve some of the oils. The waters might freeze in the fingerprint. So it's going to give us a little bit more time, maybe 48 hours, but that's usually kind of our cutoff. Is after 48 hours, we're not going to find a fingerprint, right? And if we do, it's going to be completely pointless, because it's just going to be what oil was left, and it's only going to give us a partial of a partial. Partials sometimes can be helpful, but usually not. So we're not, after 48 hours, we're just kind of, as a general rule, we know we're not going to find fingerprints, right? Let's say we're in Tucson, Arizona. We don't have the luxury of 48 hours, right? Where like the average temperature is, 101 degrees. Water gets absorbed into the atmosphere at just a ridiculous rate. We maybe have a couple of hours to find fingerprints before they're gone, right? And this is especially true if it's an outside scene. A little bit different if it's inside, it's air conditioned. But again, air conditioning, how it works, basically, in terms of producing water and taking water out of the air, we want that air conditioner off. But we want it off only to the point that it doesn't become 101 degrees inside, because just because of how air conditioners work, you generally don't want them on. But we're going to note that the inside temperature is this, the air conditioner was set at this, the outside temperature is this, the relative humidity is this. We're going to note all of that because it really becomes important, right? Because at trial, if I'm going to point out, like, so you say that this person broke into this house and shot this man, and for whatever reason you don't think he didn't have gloves on. Where are the fingerprints? That's what the jury's gonna be wondering too. If like he didn't have gloves on, where are the fingerprints? And as a detective on the stand, you can't just say, well, we didn't really look for fingerprints that I can remember, because again, this is like 2 years down the road, 3 years maybe. Like, oh, I don't remember. And that's when you have to turn back to your sketch and turn back to your notes and go, okay. So the reason we didn't find fingerprints, or we didn't decide to dust for fingerprints, is it was clear by the scene that the person had expired, and we use the term expired, at least 72 hours before investigators arrived on the scene. And then I'm going to say, okay, so what does that mean? And as a detective, you're going to say on the scene, well, fingerprints are about 80% water. And you're kind of going to walk through the steps of, so why didn't you do this? And the only way that you're going to be able to remember is by looking at your notes, looking at your sketch with the details. You're also going to want to put in identities of personnel, dimensions, a key, a legend. Like, you're going to want to sketch out everything is in this sketch. You're going to want to put like, okay, there's a bed over here, there's a window right here. So you kind of have an interactive version of what you're dealing with, right? So you can put markers and things like that down, and you get a sense of what the original scene looked like. That being said, crime scene photography, I think we covered it a little bit. There's actually a lot in your book about it, but one thing I highly recommend is taking a look at it, especially if you're interested in photography. Like I'm really big into photography. Crime scene photography is really interesting because not only because of what you see and what you do, but because it's your job to be neutral and partial, and usually follow the direction of detectives, but your photos should tell a story, right? So your photo should begin with, here's a photo of the outside of the house. Here's a photo of me looking down where first responders first stepped out. Here's a photo of the grass. Here's a photo of this, like, and walking in, like, here's the door frame. Here's the door jamb. Here's, there's nothing here. Walking into the living room, there's nothing in here. And then finally going into the den that connects to the living room. And that's where they found the body. And then you're taking pictures of trying to get every single aspect of the crime scene that you can from every angle that you can. High angles, low angles, whatever, because you don't know what's going to be important. You don't know what police are going to find and go, oh God, where was, okay, good, and find it in a crime scene photo, right? So you're snapping photos like crazy, unlike you see like in CSI, where it's like they take one picture of the body and they're like, oh, okay. Like, no, you are snapping photos like crazy, but you are, when you're doing it, you're writing down what each photo is, where each photo was taken, at what time each photo was on. So you're doing click, pull out your notebook, where it was, when it was taken, why it was done, just basic information, right? Click, what it was taken, and so you're kind of keeping track of the photographs and tying data to them, so that when detectives look at it later, they can say, okay, what angle, what the hell is this? And they're like, oh, it's a close-up of a hairbrush or something, right? Like, okay, I get it now. So you're going to take extensive details. You're going to tell a story with your photos. That being said, the photographs, usually you're going to be kind of, it's going to occur before you do a search of the area. If you do a search of the immediate area, there are a few ways that we can do a search, right? So let's say we have the photographs taken, and now detectives want to search the scene to see if there's casings, if there's blood spatter, if there's signs of a struggle, if there's something that maybe is like, oh, here's a partial footprint, or maybe this is a surface where we need to get somebody to dust this because this is very conducive to fingerprints. Whatever. Investigators have to choose how they're going to conduct that search, right? So they can't just go willy-nilly like, oh, I'm going to look in this corner and then look in this drawer and this drawer. No, it has to be thought out and planned well in advance. So when we think about the ways that we can conduct a search, really there's four primary ways, right? So we have a grid search, a spiral search, which can be an inward and an outward spiral search, a parallel search, or a zone search. So let's look at these. So these are just kind of what they look like. In general, we're kind of looked at some zoomed up versions here in a little bit, but as you see here, you have a grid search, you have an inward spiral, an outward spiral, a parallel search, and a zone search. Now, in this case, it looks like it's the exact same room that's being searched. And you'll see that when we get into it, that sometimes some searches are more appropriate than others, like doing a parallel search. That in a small room like that probably wouldn't make sense, or especially even a zone search probably wouldn't make sense. And we're going to talk about like which ones are kind of the best to use. So this is again the same picture just blown up, the search pattern of a grid, right? So we know that a grid basically is simply like two parallel searches, right, offset by 90 degrees, one performed right after the other. So what a grid search is, I mean, as you can tell by the photo, it's generally very effective, right? Because look at the photo. I mean, you have seen and looked and touched and, examined almost every aspect of this scene. I mean, the arrows are probably gonna be a little closer together in real life, but I mean, you've covered the scene in depth, right? So it's very effective in finding evidence, especially in houses or even in outdoor vicinities. But usually we use a different progress than that. That being said, there's a problem in the sense that it's very time consuming, right? And we know that time is not always on our side. Yes, we have the photographs taken. Awesome. We're having the photographer still there in case we find a fingerprint. We dust for it. They're going to take pictures of that and then label that and all that jazz. But it's time consuming to do this. So if an investigator says, oh, I want this dusted. Well, it might take them 4 hours to get to that point of finding that thing that they want dusted. And if there's an air conditioner going or what have you, maybe the print is gone. So it's time consuming. It's a problem. Usually it's like one or two investigators that'll be doing the search. But again, you have to use what makes sense, right? And in the case of our 94-year-old dead woman, like we're not going to search. And we're especially hell not going to do a grid. We might look around, but we're not going to do like a grid search and like this really formalized process. So again, responses are really different just depending on the scene and the nature of if it's an emergency and non-emergency. If it's clear that it's obvious that it's a homicide versus it's an unequivocal death investigation, what have you. So then we have the spiral patterns, right? Spiral patterns are good when there's only one CSI or one investigator, one detective on the scene, or one investigator doing it, I should say, right? That being said, they're very rare, very rarely used. And the reason they're very rarely used is because they're not really conducive to physical barriers, right? So take a look at the photographs in front of you. See, there's two ways we can do it. We can start from the outside of the room and spiral in, theoretically covering most of in kind of like tighter circles till we get to the body or the point of the room that we're interested in. That's our end point. It's better if one person does it, right? Because I mean, having 2 or 3 people is just, that's going to contaminate the scene. So if you have limited personnel, it's a good thing to do. It's very rarely used. The other way you can search is the outward version of a spiral. So this is where you start with the thing that you're interested in, that you're investigating, and then move outward and kind of spiral outward. So this is probably the better of the two, because you're beginning with and this is usually, if we're talking homicide investigation, this is a body, right? So it makes sense to start at the body and then start slowly working your way around, making sure that you cover every single aspect, you see every single thing, and you do a spiral outward. And the reason you do that too, it helps you take notes, it helps you with crime scene photography, it helps a lot of things to know what pattern you're doing, to write it down, so that you can say exactly what happened, when it happened, where in your pattern you were. So this is probably the more effective, but as you can see, it's not conducive to physical barriers, right? Like this, in this case, there's a nightstand, there's a bed, an outward spiral, an inward spiral. You have to go on top of the bed, over the nightstand. Like, you're obviously gonna take pictures of it, so it's not gonna be a perfect spiral. And you're going to kind of like, walk around the bed and look under it and stuff like that. So it's not going to be perfect spiral, but it's a little bit more pain in the butt. But as you can see, the spiral has to end in the room, right? So the spiral can't go out that open door. A grid search theoretically could go out the open door, right? Because you could theoretically just expand that part of the grid. So again, doing spiral searches, very rare, but if you only have one person, then they're usually going to start with an outward spiral, where they start with the body and then move outward. Then we have parallel search patterns. I know you've seen these on TV. These are usually work for large areas, especially large outdoor areas, right? So basically what happens is all of the members of the CSI team, they form a line, and then they walk in a straight line at the same speed from one end of the crime scene to the other end of the crime scene. Now, in large rooms, okay, I mean, grids are always preferable, but you can do parallel. But if, let's say, we're out in the woods, or at least we're outside, maybe, not even in the woods. Let's say we're in a field, a large field, a really large field. We're going to have CSI lined up, and maybe sometimes we have to get volunteers from the community to help. We don't like that for numerous reasons. One being, a volunteer could be a perp, so you always sign in volunteers and you do a little investigation to who comes. Trying to cover their tracks, we also don't want like Bambi stumbling in and like burying, accidentally like stepping on a bullet casing or something along those lines, right? Like, we want people who are trained to do it. But if we are searching, let's say, for a missing person, then yeah, we're going to want probably as many people as we can, volunteers. But again, the more volunteers, the more investigation you have to do, the more likely that they're going to contaminate the scene, whatever. But if it's an emergency, we're searching for this person, they're lost, parallel works really well, because theoretically, as you're walking side by side, you can see anything like, oh, there's actually a hole here in the ground that maybe you wouldn't have discovered otherwise, right? So then you can kind of investigate the hole, or you can see like, oh, look, there's a, like right in front of me, there's a cave entrance. It's going to work better in kind of that setting. And again, we're going to require a lot of people. And if we go with volunteers, that's a whole different nightmare. Sometimes they're needed, right? But like, we try not to. if we can. Because again, I'm going to get on the stand, or I'm going to have you on the stand, and I'm going to say, wait, so you used untrained, non-professional people who just showed up to watch a crime scene search because there was a dead body found. You used them to do the crime scene search? You used them to do part of the investigation? What? Like, that doesn't come across good at all. It like, it's understandable in some respects, but yeah, it always use the CSI team, use investigators. Like, don't use people who are not trained to deal with evidence, or who are not trained to literally look down at their feet so they're not stepping in. Oh, look, this is a shoe print, or something along those lines. Volunteers, they can be perpetrators, so that could be helpful, but they also are, I mean, they're trying to do the right thing, good people for the most part, but they're not trained, right? CSI are. So if you have them, use them. If you need more people, get line officers, right? Call in officers from another county, another city, whatever, people who are trained to do this job. And then the last type of search that we have is the zone search pattern, right? So basically in this, what happens is the detective in charge, or the CSI in charge, divides the crime scene into sectors or sections. Okay? Now, each member of the team, so one person, takes one sector. Then team members may then switch sectors and search again, right? So let's say you have going from the bed over to the chair, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And you have them search, and when they all say they completed their search and taken documentation of everything and all that jazz, then you're going to have them switch to a different grid and start the search or a different sector and start that search all over again. Now, it might seem redundant, but the idea here is it's a small little place, so you could, even the CSI in the small sector could do a grid search, right, in the small sector. They could do a spiral search, I mean, whatever makes sense for them. So they're doing their search in the sector, they might miss something. Right? Like it happens. So if we do a switch after the first person investigates and the second person comes and investigates and they find something, awesome, because then it would have been missed. They don't find anything, awesome, because it means the first person did their job. And it's going to be harder for the defendant to shoot that down on the stand, right? For a defense attorney to go in and say, wait, you searched this premises, right? Yeah. So you did, they're going to walk through the parts of the search. So you had a person just check each room, really kind of without any accountability. And it's like, no. Actually, there was a second search too, where we switched up the sectors and there was no difference in evidence. Or, well, actually, one did uncover a bullet casing that the first investigator missed. We're going to kind of want that accountability and that kind of secondary emphasis on our case that really helps build the case against the defendant, right? The defendant can't really shoot down. This usually is the pattern for warrant searches. So when you have a search warrant or executing a search warrant, this is generally how it's going to be, right? So the officers at CSI, they're going to break up the house, break up the room into sectors. They're going to search each one. They may do rotation, they may not, just depending on what the underlying offense is. I will say this: search warrant searches, there's really no care about preservation of the crime scene. Like, they just take all your drawers, dump them out on your bed, leave the drawers out. They take every book off your bookcase. I mean, like, they're under no obligation to put the stuff back. Like, they are. So, you kind of have something along those lines. All right, so that kind of gives us like a search warrant pattern. This is kind of normal. But again, it works really well in buildings because buildings generally are square and you can kind of divide them up fairly easily. And then you can do like mini crime scene and kind of treat them as mini crime scenes. Right? And again, smaller the crime scene, a little easier it's going to be to tackle. So you can do a sketch of each sector. You can do grid search in each sector. You can do whatever you need to do in each sector. And again, taking notes of and getting photographs is necessary. So then processing the crime scene. Fourth step, we're going to determine the order in which physical evidence will be collected, beginning with the easily alterable or deteriorating evidence. So once we say, okay, we found this here, 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 then the detectives and the CSI have to figure out, okay, what's the order in which we are going to take that evidence, secure it, and secure it as a part of this investigation for analysis. Right? Well, we're going to start with the stuff that deteriorates. Right? So DNA deteriorates really quickly. Fingerprints deteriorate really quickly. Blood doesn't deteriorate so much, but it loses its usefulness real quickly. So we're going to go with the stuff that's kind of like the fluids and the stuff like that are really easily deterioratable. We're also going to go with like footprints, right? Because those are easily alterable. All you have to do is put like one line in them and it changes the whole thing. So we're going to go with anything that is precious first and then move on from there. Fifth, the team members should ensure collection using a thorough systematic approach, being aware of what's called Locard's exchange principle. Now, this is a very, very, very important thing to note. Locard's exchange principle states that every time you make contact with another person, place, or thing, it results in an exchange of physical materials. Right? So think about this like when you see like a car accident, right? And one car is red and one car is white. The red car is going to have a white streak on it from the white paint from the other car, and the red car or the white car is going to have a red streak, and the red car is going to have a white streak. That's the exchange, right? But that happens at any time. So that happens when you shake hands with somebody. Your skin cells, little tiny skin cells. You put some on their hand, they put some on your hand, right? And locations and things like that. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. It's a really, really important principle. To that end, that's why CSI wear gloves, respirators, whatever they need to do to minimize the transfer of evidence from them into the evidence, right, which would contaminate it. And then finally, the team should be debriefed afterwards, right? So more notes are taken. What did you do? Why did you do it? And all that jazz. And then finally, everyone should file their reports, right? So the idea is generating a massive amount of information. We can't generate enough information. So that being said, one thing that I will note is a really interesting case is the O.J. Simpson case. Because CSI was interesting, right? This is where you had the really slow police chase in the Bronco. You have the glove doesn't fit, you must have quit. So basically, like, there was a super racist cop named Mark Furman who planted evidence. Like, did OJ do it? Like, yeah, probably. I mean, he even wrote a confession, like his book, If I Did It. But so yeah, probably, right? That's probably. Do I know for sure? No, but probably. But it didn't help and actually probably cost the conviction, was Mark Furman screwed with the crime scene, right? He planted a bloody glove, and that was the famous glove that didn't fit. Like, he didn't think about how big O.J. Simpson, who was a giant football player, how big his hands were. So like when they tried on the bloody glove, it didn't fit. He planted it. He planted blood in different places around OJ's property, different things like that. And he got called out on the stand. I mean, the defense just tore him apart. And he sunk the case, right? So like as soon as jury hears that somebody was fabricating evidence or they were not doing their job properly, they're going to shut down a lot of what that person has to say, right? And in this case, like he's he appeared, right, to be racist, in my opinion. So that's kind of take a look at O.J. Simpson, like do some research on it, take a look at in the book, and you can kind of see the different search techniques and the problems with CSI. That being said, next class, we're going to look at biological evidence and scientific analysis. Right, so this is going to include things like DNA, blood, saliva, urine, semen, feces. We're going to look at what biological evidence is, how to collect it, and then how to do the actual analysis on it. All right, so as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. That being said, I hope you have a wonderful day.